Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to welcome you to our webinar today, Do Residential Ventilation Rates Affect Respiratory Health? Our presenter today is Dr. William Fisk. He is a senior scientist in the Indoor Environments Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. For 40 years, he's conducted research on indoor air quality and its effects on occupants. Since 2003, he has led the Indoor Environmental Research Program at LBNL, and he has authored more than 120 related journal articles and is a member of the International Academy of Indoor Air Sciences and a fellow of ASHRAE. Thank you so much, Bill, for agreeing to do this, and we are so looking forward to it. I'll now hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks everybody for calling into this webinar. First of all, why do we care about residential ventilation rates? Well, first of all, the homes are really important. On average, we spend 70% of our time, 70% of our lives in homes in developed countries. Our homes contain a myriad of indoor air pollutant sources, such as building materials and furnishings, consumer and personal care products, pets, pests, dampness and mold, cooking, and the people themselves. And the ventilation rate will affect the concentrations of many of these pollutants from the indoor sources. Higher ventilation will reduce the concentrations. At the same time, the ventilation process brings outdoor air pollutants from outdoors to indoors, increasing the indoor concentrations of some of those pollutants. And the ventilation rates affect the amount of energy needed to heat and cool our home. So ventilation rates are important to health and to energy, and we want to know how much we should provide to homes. Given the complexity, it's very difficult to model, have a theory and model and predict how ventilation rates will affect health. So we need empirical data, and we have had relatively limited empirical data, but the amount available is growing. So this presentation will tell us what the available data says about the relationship of home ventilation rates with respiratory health. So I'll start with a little context, a little more context, go over the methods that have been employed in the studies to address this question. I'll outline the content of this review, describe the findings, and then we'll discuss conclusions and implications. So a few important concepts that you need to have in mind so you don't get lost here. By ventilation rate, I mean the rate of replacement of indoor air with outdoor air. It's the rate of airflow from outdoors to indoors. And in homes, it's usually expressed in units of air changes per hour, but it can be expressed in other units. By statistically significant, in this context, I mean that there's less than a 5% probability that the reported association or correlation is the result of chance. And you'll see me use the SS abbreviation for statistically significant in slides. And then a more difficult concept is confounding. Confounding occurs in our context here when a third factor that's correlated with both ventilation rate and with the health outcome of interest influences the correlation of ventilation rate with health. And let me just give you an example here. Let's say occupants of homes with smokers have worsened health because of their smoke exposure, and they also try to keep indoor smoke levels reduced by keeping windows open, so they increase ventilation rates. Then these high ventilation rates would be statistically correlated with worsened health, while tobacco smoke is the true cause of the increased health effects. So there's many potential confounding factors in the types of studies that I'm going to present, and it's important that the studies have identified and controlled for confounding factors. And as you'll see, most of them have done a pretty good job in this regard, but always keep in mind the potential for confounding. Also, what should be relevant is what did we find in other types of buildings, because we might expect the same thing in homes. Well, in offices, we have a larger body of research, and that research has shown that when we have higher ventilation rates, we tend to have fewer sick building syndrome symptoms. And the relationship is pretty strong, as shown by the red line in the chart on the right. Also, with higher ventilation rates, we have improved task performance. And we have quite a bit of research from schools finding that higher ventilation rates are associated with improved student performance and often with improvements in test scores. And in 4 out of 5 studies, higher ventilation rates in schools are associated with reduced absence. So our theory, our hypothesis is that the home ventilation rate is going to influence our indoor contaminant exposures when we're at home, and we're at home most of the time, and in turn influence health. But the relationship is much more complicated. Many other factors affect the indoor contaminant exposures at home, such as the strengths of the sources that are present in the home, the level of outdoor air quality, the kind of filtration employed, people's behaviors, and an even greater range of factors influences our respiratory health, susceptibility, health status, exposure in other indoor environments and outdoors, diet, probably exercise. So one should not expect to get the same relationship between ventilation rate and health outcomes in every situation. It's going to vary depending on all these other factors. So this is basically a review of the published literature. We then identified papers using 2 search tools, Google Scholar and PubMed, and you can see the search terms that were employed. And we excluded certain studies, those not reported in journal articles because they haven't gone through the rigorous review of journal articles. We excluded studies that didn't measure either ventilation rates or carbon dioxide concentrations as indicators of ventilation rates. Also, a number of studies compared occupants of green homes and conventional homes, and then sort of concluded that ventilation improved health or affected health based on those studies. But we excluded those studies because there can be many differences between green and conventional homes besides just differences in ventilation rates. And for the same reason, studies that compared occupants of special healthy homes and conventional homes were excluded from this review. We did include a few studies that increased ventilation rates and simultaneously included some other exposure control measure. For example, they might have used mattress covers for dust mite exposure control. But we only included those in the review if the study had periods of time or homes that had the additional exposure control measure, such that the comparison is one where the only difference is ventilation rate. Okay, so with that, we identified 20 studies that met the inclusion and exclusion criteria. 5 of these are cross-sectional studies, 7 are case control studies, and 8 are intervention studies. And in a moment, I'll explain these study types. The cross-sectional case control studies, in almost all cases, did quite a thorough job of identifying and controlling for confounding, which I described earlier. They used complicated models, statistical models called multivariate statistical models to adjust for potential confounding. In the intervention studies, 6 out of 8 of those intervention studies had placebos or blinding. That is, the people didn't know when the ventilation rate was being changed. As you can see, 12 studies are from Europe, so the literature overrepresents Europe, 5 from North America, 3 from China, and most of the health outcomes were allergy or asthma related or other respiratory outcomes. And most commonly, the outcomes were symptoms that were reported by subjects on questionnaires, or respiratory infections like common cold reported by subjects on questionnaires. But quite a few studies had measured outcomes like measurements of lung function or exhaled nitric oxide, which is a measure of inflammation or bronchial hyperresponsiveness. So I mentioned the 3 kinds of studies, and I want you to understand what these studies are like. Okay, in cross-sectional studies, the researchers collect data from a large sample of homes and occupants. They collect health data from questionnaires or perform health tests. They collect demographic data, home characteristics data, and they measure the ventilation rates or the CO2 levels. And then they use statistical models to assess the association, which is really just the correlation of health outcomes with ventilation rates or with CO2 levels as an indicator of ventilation rates, adjusted for the potential confounding factors. And the outcome is then an indication of the magnitude of the relationship of ventilation rate with health and the statistical significance of that relationship. So the case control studies are pretty similar in methodology, except they start with 2 groups of people. One group has an identified health effect known in advance. For example, might be a group of people with wheeze. And there's a matched group of people who don't have that health effect. And this gives you somewhat greater power to study the effects. But the subsequent procedures are pretty similar, and the outcome metrics are pretty similar between these and the cross-sectional studies. And then the strongest type of study methodologically are the intervention studies, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And there's a couple approaches. In one case, we select a sample of homes, and we divide them into 2 groups, those in which we're going to intervene, that is, modify the ventilation rate, and control homes where we don't intervene. We assess health in both groups. We increase ventilation or decrease it only in the intervention homes, and again assess health. At the same time, we have a placebo, a fake increase in ventilation in the control homes, and we assess health. Even better is what's called a crossover intervention study, where we take the sample of homes and we basically do the same thing in each of 2 groups, but in a different order. So in the top row there, in one group, we increase the ventilation rate and assess health when the ventilation rate is increased, and then we bring it back down, say, to its original value and assess health. In the second group, we do the same thing, but in the opposite order. Allows us to control better for any kind of extraneous effects that might happen over time. So the advantage of these studies is that we assess changes in health within subjects when the ventilation rate is changed, in most cases when the ventilation rate has been increased, relative to changes in health within subjects when ventilation rate is not changed. And because we're doing within subjects, we have much less potential for confounding error. Okay, you don't have to worry too much about this table. I just want to say, for those of you who want to dig into the weeds, I'm going to reference a paper at the end of this presentation that has detailed results, detailed descriptions of all the studies, and then detailed results tabulated, such as shown in this slide here for weeds. But I'm going to show you the results in a simpler manner. Okay, for weeds, so we're going to, for each outcome, we're going to look at the nature of the findings. Were they statistically significant, and did they indicate improved health or not? And then we're going to look at the magnitudes of the effects. So for weeds, there were 8 studies in this review, and as you can see, 3 of them reported a statistically significant health improvement. Those 8 studies had 14 assessments or statistical tests, and health improved, it looks like, in 6 out of 14 tests. Health, and that the second set of bars here is regardless of statistical significance. Health improved in 6 out of 14 cases, and health worsened in 1 case, and information wasn't provided in the remaining cases. Out of those 14 statistical tests, however, there were 4 of those improvements in health were statistically significant. So what we see here is some evidence of improved health, but in a minority of cases, are those improvements statistically significant? Well, what about the size of the effect? Okay, so these are the magnitudes of the improvements in wheeze with increased ventilation reported in the studies, and the green ones are the findings that are statistically significant. And so for wheeze, those improvements ranged from about 20% to almost 80%. And the numbers listed in black are the non-significant ones, and you can see that there's one instance when there was a statistically non-significant 30% worsening of wheeze, but there was only 1 worsening out of all these data. Okay, these are the results for cough. For cough, there were 6 studies, and 2 of them, only 2 reported a statistically significant health improvement. Those 6 studies had 8 assessments or statistical tests, and in half of those, regardless of statistical significance, the results indicated an improvement in health. In the other half, information wasn't provided. But only 2 out of 8 of those statistical tests found a statistically significant improvement in health. And the magnitudes, you can see when they were statistically significant, the improvements in cough, in this case, were 50 and 56%. And you can see the non-significant results here are also improvements in cough, but they're too small and not statistically significant. Okay, 3 studies looked at respiratory infections as outcomes. And as you can see, only one of those, 1 out of 3, reported a statistically significant improvement, reduction in respiratory infection. But there were 7 statistical tests, and all but 1, 6, regardless of statistical significance, all but 1 suggested improvement in respiratory infection with increased ventilation rate, and 1 suggests a worsening of health. There were 2 out of 7 tests that had statistically significant improvements in health. And again, the magnitudes in this case with respiratory infection, you can see there's not a lot of data in this category. When statistically significant, the improvements are 33 and 65%. So I'm going to spare you going over the same results for all of health outcomes and give you some sort of summary information. So this slide shows on the left all the health outcomes included in the review. And for each health outcome, the blue bar indicates the number of statistical tests from all the studies combined. The green bar indicates the number of tests for that outcome for which there was a statistically significant improvement in health. And the red bar indicates for that outcome the number of tests for which there was a statistically significant worsening in health. So a couple observations. You can see in almost all cases, it's a small fraction of instances in which there was a statistically significant improvement in health. But you can see a lot more green bars than red bars. So there's far more statistically significant improvements in health than there are statistically significant worsenings in health. This is sort of another way to look at that question. Remember when I defined statistically significant, I said there was a 95% probability that the reported result was not a chance result. But that means that there's a 5% probability that it was a chance result. So one can get a statistically significant finding in studies when there's really no underlying relationship, just by chance. And that'll happen given the criteria we use 5% of the time, and 2.5% of the time that result will indicate an improvement in health, and 2.5% of the time we'd expect that chance result to indicate a worsening of health. What we see here is that for all these results together, all 135 or so of them, we would expect about the chance statistically significant improvement. Health, and we have far more. We have, in fact, about 7 times as many as expected by chance. So the evidence of improvements in health exceeds what we would expect by chance. We take a body of literature that includes a large number of tests. If you look at the red bars, however, the reported statistically significant worsenings in health match what we expect from chance. So when you do this kind of review, it's important to look at subset of studies. For example, I mentioned before the strengths, the intervention studies. So we looked at intervention studies as a group, particularly the strongest ones. We looked at few studies in multi-unit residential facilities, studies with high indoor pollutant sources, like tobacco smoking or wood smoke, studies with high outdoor pollution, such as studies in urban areas of China, and the strongest cross-sectional case control studies. When you look at the subsets of studies, you get the same basic result. What you find is evidence of improvement in health that looks like more than expected by chance, but the improvements in health are far from consistent. The overall findings from this review are that from a slight majority of studies, there was a statistically significant improvement in health with increased ventilation rate. But no health outcome was consistently improved with increased ventilation rate. The magnitude of improvements in health with increased ventilation rate range from about 20 to 50%. That's when they're statistically significant, with one high value of 80%. When one looks at the fraction of instances in which health improved and the magnitude of the improvements, increased ventilation rate appears to be most likely helpful for wheeze as an outcome among the outcomes we considered. For all the studies combined, there were 7 times more statistically significant improvements in health with increased ventilation rate than we can expect by chance. So it doesn't look like evidence of improvements, albeit inconsistent evidence of improvements, is just not chance. It's more than chance by far. I didn't go into the details, but it's important to note that the research findings do not indicate a threshold ventilation rate below which health worsens. So they can't, given the research we have today, we can't say this is where we should set a minimum ventilation rate standard, for example. Just don't have the kinds of research needed to identify that, and it's possible that a threshold does not exist. And finally, important to keep in mind that the empirical data that I presented are just on respiratory health outcomes. And in fact, we really don't have empirical data to assess the influence of home ventilation rates on other types of health outcomes, for example, cancer as an outcome. So this is what we have available to us, focusing on respiratory health, but it's not the whole story. So, in conclusion, the available evidence suggests that increased ventilation rates in homes improves respiratory health, but certainly not consistently. The implication then is that we should avoid low ventilation rates because they're often helpful, but we should always combine that with measures to limit indoor pollutant sources and to remove particles with filtration. So you can find a lot more information on this topic and other topics about how indoor environments affect health and performance at the ieqscience.lbl.gov website. And this presentation was based on a paper published in Indoor Air Journal in volume 28. So if you want more details, you can go to that journal article. I think that's it, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Bill. Could you please provide your key overall observations one more time for us?
Overall, in this body of literature, a slight majority of studies indicate a statistically significant improvement in health with increased ventilation rates. But none of the health outcomes were consistently improved with increased ventilation rate. When the changes in health were statistically significant, they were almost always improvements in health, and they ranged in magnitude from about 20 to 50%. When one looks at the data in detail, the size of the improvements, and the fraction of instances in which health improved, I'd say that increased ventilation rate in this data set appears most helpful for wheeze. For all the studies combined, there were 7 times more statistically significant improvements in health with increased ventilation than expected by chance. So even though the findings are inconsistent here, there's a lot more evidence of improved health than one can project simply by chance findings. There's not enough information in the literature to define a threshold ventilation rate below which health worsens. So we don't have really good guidance here for minimum ventilation standards in homes. And it's important to note that we focused on respiratory health, and I focused on that topic because we really don't have any significant empirical data for other health outcomes. So we don't have empirical data, for example, on how ventilation rates might affect cancer outcomes or other chronic outcomes among people. So my conclusion is that the evidence available today suggests increased ventilation rates in homes on average improves respiratory health, but certainly not consistently. And that means we should try to avoid low ventilation rates because it's often helpful, but we should certainly always combine that with measures to limit indoor pollutant sources and to remove particles with filtration. And I can point you to the IAQscience.ldl.gov website for more information on this topic and many other topics about how indoor environmental conditions affect people, their health, their performance, their absence. And also, for more details on this particular talk, you can go to the Indoor Air Journal, volume 28 in 2018, and find the detailed results. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. We got a variety of questions for you today, Bill, and the first one is, did these studies measure indoor relative humidity, moisture, and temperature levels relative to outdoor levels? Also, did these studies correlate the use of outdoor air filtration?
Well, studies varied, and I don't recall exactly what fraction, but many of the studies did not report indoor temperature and humidity in relation to outdoor levels. So those could potentially be factors that were confounders that weren't controlled in some of the studies. And also the studies didn't report on filtration practices. But you have to keep in mind, for those factors to influence the results, they'd have to be related to both ventilation rate and health, correlated with both ventilation rate and health in order to confound the results we show here. Some of the studies, the intervention studies, 8 of them had sort of more controlled conditions, and so it's, I think, much less likely that temperature, humidity, and filtration would have been a factor in those studies.
Thank you. Another question. How can studies in office settings and schools inform residential ventilation rates?
Well, I think we can just say that we might expect the same general trends from office studies in schools as in homes, but not exactly the same results because we tend to have different types of pollutant sources in offices and schools. But in general, we would anticipate that if ventilation is effective in improving health in other types of buildings, it might be the same in homes. One of the advantages of offices and schools is people have been able to do studies and get a large number of occupants much more easily than they've been able to do that at home. So the studies from other building types tend to have had more power than the studies from homes.
Thank you. Another question. How were ventilation rates increased? Same method for all studies?
Not in all studies, but first of all, remember, 8 of the studies were intervention studies where they modified ventilation rates and kept everything else constant. And the other studies were cross-sectional. So in the cross-sectional and case control studies, they just looked at a sample of homes and measured ventilation rates. They didn't change them. But where they were increased, most often it's called a heat recovery ventilator. A mechanical ventilation system was installed in the homes. And so they might install that system in the home and run it during some periods and make it seem like it's running and bringing in outside air, but it's not actually bringing in outside air during other periods. So that was the most common practice.
Thank you. Next question. Would it be possible to contrast the findings of self-reported versus more objective health endpoints?
Yeah, the paper does that to some extent because there's some different health outcomes, some of the measured ones like lung function and so forth, versus the symptom outcomes. And I don't think we see sort of a striking difference in results between those two types of outcomes. I mean, it's a good question because self-reported outcomes, one has somewhat lower confidence in those than objective measured outcomes. But for many outcomes, self-reported outcomes are the gold standard. For example, a classic example is headache. We can't measure a headache, but people can say whether they have a headache or not.
Thank you. We have received another question. Based on the studies that you have seen, which confounders should be better controlled in future studies?
Good question. One of the outcomes that wasn't controlled in every study in the cross-sectional case control studies and some of the European studies was socioeconomic status. And socioeconomic status is sort of a catch-all for a variety of factors, and it's clearly related to health in, say, the United States. Some of the Northern European countries have smaller ranges in socioeconomic status, and they tend not to control for that. But I'd like to see that done better. One of the previous persons asked about temperature and humidity and filtration. I'd like to see more attention to those parameters in future studies as well. But I do think that there's been a pretty good effort in these studies to control for a range of confounders, and the ones that have been shown to be related to respiratory health.
Thank you. Another attendee asks, to what extent do these conclusions account for the quality of ambient outdoor air? How might case studies in urban settings influence the findings?
Yeah, I referred to that briefly, and it's discussed a little more in the paper. What we did do is look at studies that were performed where outdoor air was thought to be particularly poor, or where there were mentions of poor air quality, and mostly those were also studies in urban areas of China, so we couldn't really separate China from poor outdoor air quality. But in that subset of studies, we see pretty much, and it's a pretty small subset, we see sort of the same result. So there was not clear from that set of studies that when we have more outdoor air pollution, ventilation is less helpful, which is what one would expect in advance, but it didn't really come out given the data available.
Thank you. Another attendee asks, did you find any correlations, even if anecdotal, between the ventilation rate and health improvement?
That was the sort of subject of this, yes. And there was inconsistent evidence of improvements in a variety of respiratory health effects with increased ventilation rate, and that the frequency of that improvement was far more than we could expect by chance. So the main message here is it looks like increased ventilation in homes on average improves respiratory health, but it doesn't do so in any consistent manner. It does so in some instances for some people.
Thank you. Another attendee asks, was there a common increased ventilation rate in all studies? How are those rates increased? For example, exhaust fan supply, etc.
Again, I think it was 8 out of 20 studies increased ventilation rates. In the other studies, we looked at the natural variability of ventilation rates and how they relate to health. So in the 8 studies, actually 7 of the 8 intervention studies increased ventilation rates. And as I mentioned a minute ago, typically they did that with what's called a heat recovery ventilator, a mechanical ventilation system, and they include periods of placebo or fake increase in ventilation, or they included a population with a fake increase in ventilation with a heat recovery ventilator. The range of increase varied somewhat, and it's in the paper, typically, probably about 0.4, 0.5 air changes per hour, 0.3 to maybe 0.3 might be a typical number for an increase in those studies. There was one study that looked at a decrease in ventilation rate as the intervention, but it had, and they were aiming for like a 20% decrease, but it looks like they only got about a 10% decrease in ventilation rate. And I think that study involved exhaust fans, where the other ones were heat recovery ventilators.
Thank you. Another attendee asks, what issues should I look for in my home that can cause respiratory issues, and what can I do to improve the ventilation in my home?
Okay, there's a host of issues that affect respiratory health in homes. And so the first thing is always to focus on the sources of pollutants that might affect respiratory health. Particles, whether from indoor sources or outdoor, often are the most potent, most strongly related to health. So reducing sources of particles, indoor sources are cooking and tobacco smoking and candles and materials like that, which could be reduced. And then one can also do a better job of particle filtration in your forced air system, or using portable air cleaners to reduce particles indoors. Allergens indoors are very important to respiratory health. About 20% of the population has environmental allergies, so if you are allergic and the common allergen sources are dust mites, which are hard to control, but mattress covers may be helpful, cockroach, rodents, pets of various types, and then trapped-in allergens from outdoor air. So reducing the sources and space cleaning are options for those pollutants, and filtration has been shown to be somewhat helpful for reducing allergen health outcomes. So those are some of the key priorities I'd focus on. How to improve ventilation rate in your homes. If you're in an area with good outdoor air quality, you can use windows open more often, or you can have companies install mechanical ventilation systems that are either typically exhaust fans that run continuously, or these balanced mechanical ventilation systems called heat recovery ventilators. So you'd have to get a company that specializes in, or that provides services for residential mechanical ventilation, and they could help you install those devices.
Thank you. And follow up on that question, and another attendee asks, can you please comment on increasing ventilation by opening windows versus using mechanical ventilation? I know you touched on that briefly.
Yeah, I mean, the literature there's not enough literature for me to distinguish between those two in any strong way. The advantage of mechanical ventilation is significant. That is, you can control the amount easily, and you can put filters into the incoming outside air, and you can remove particles. And I think those are important advantages. The disadvantage is that the available data shows that people often don't understand how to use their mechanical ventilation systems, or they turn them off, or they're noisy. So in practice, the record hasn't been as good as the theory. But if you're going to actually use it and keep the filters clean and so forth, I would suggest mechanical ventilation as a preferred option.
Thank you, Bill. it looks like those are all of our questions for today. Laureen, would you care to take a comment?
Yes, thank you so much, Bill. That was very interesting. We apologize for the audio difficulty and really appreciate that you ran back over those closing features. We will be posting this webinar hopefully within a few weeks, and we hope that you all enjoyed today's presentation. If you have any additional issues or questions, please feel free to get in touch with us with the EPA website, which is listed there, www.epa.gov/IAQ. Thanks again, Bill, and good evening.
Thank you.